Afro-American militancy. Tonight, we will deal with Cyril V. Briggs. Modern black militancy has been plagued with dissension between nationalist and socialist. The life of Cyril V. Briggs gives hope that reconciliation between these two forces is possible. Briggs was one of many immigrants from the West Indies to get involved in post-World War I Negro radicalism. His mother, a Negro, had lived with a white man on the island of St. Kitts. There young Briggs was born, taking his name from his mother's side of the family, his parents never having officially married. A capable young man, he was still in his 20s and fresh from the islands when he landed a job as editor of the New York Amsterdam News. He brought a degree of militancy to that paper, a militancy which found far freer expression when he began his own Crusader monthly late in 1918. In a way, Briggs was forced into a writer's career, inasmuch as a serious speech impediment kept him from many other professions. In the spring of 1919, he founded the African Blood Brotherhood. This version of a socialist alternative to Garveyites was created because of Garvey's failure to tackle domestic problems of Negro workers, and because the Back to Africa scheme was seen as visionary and defeatist. These negative factors in Garveyism outweighed the emphasis on race consciousness and African redemption, which Briggs considered constructive and appropriate. On occasions, Briggs even aided the Garveyites, notwithstanding his ideological differences with them. During the Unity year of 1919, year in which radicals were too busy, it seemed, fighting race riots and other problems to divide among themselves. During this year, Briggs played a leading role in the Black Star Line purchase of the steamship General Goethals. The Black Star Line was Garvey's steamship company to take Negroes back to Africa. Briggs, being of blonde hair and light complexion, went down to Wall Street and passed as a white man in the shipping business. And he bought the Goethals, and later the former owners became irate when they learned that they had sold it to a front man for a group of Negroes. They were even more surprised to learn that they had already sold the Goethals to a Negro, Briggs. The form of socialism evolved by Briggs and expressed in the Crusader incorporated much of the nationalistic spirit of the post-World War I period. There was a free mixing of anti-capitalism with emotional diatribes against whites in general. In Briggs' editorials, the American way of life stacked up as an arch-villain of history. In November of 1919, in the issue of November 1919, he heaped derision on the American intervention in Mexico to chase Pancho Villa. "What's this?" asked Briggs. "Americans trying to preserve law and order in Mexico? The mob rule in the United States will make law and order in Mexico. The barbarous and benighted United States raids the land of a people who, by all indications, seem quite able to live together without engaging in race wars, mob violence, and the fiendish torture of human beings which are so freely and heartily indulged in on this side of the Rio Grande, and which more than any other thing in contemporary American history are the salient and identifying features of the much-vaunted American civilization." The reasons for the invasion, according to Briggs, were the desire of American capitalists and their hunkers to seize Mexican oil and mineral wealth, and the rationale for this imperialism rested in the fact that Mexico was peopled by a colored race, the independence of which white America saw no reason to respect. Briggs was a staunch supporter of the IWW and the left wing of the Socialist Party. His goal was to have Negroes organize among themselves and then work with the white left. The African Blood Brotherhood, of which Briggs was executive head, was structured as a secretive society, much like a lodge or fraternity, with members under the leadership of a Supreme Executive Council. There was a death penalty for revealing certain secrets of the Brotherhood. And as an elite organization of militants, the Brotherhood was to be the power behind a world federation of radical Negro groups. And for a time there were active Brotherhood branches in a number of Caribbean islands. The logic of the Brotherhood working with leftists, such as the IWW, and socialists, was expressed in terms of self-preservation for the Negro group. In describing why we are Bolsheviks, Briggs explained, "We would not for a moment hesitate to ally ourselves with any group if by such an alliance we could compass the liberation of our race and the redemption of our fatherland." In favoring the IWW, Briggs accented the more immediate tangible benefits to us. By supporting the IWW, we forced the AFL to provide job openings. By voting socialist, we can force belated justice and consideration from the Republicans. The nationalistic streak in the Crusader was shown not only by Briggs but by other writers as well. Whites were again and again described with adjectives like fiends and fiends incarnate, and it appeared to be Crusader style to substitute mobocracy for democracy when referring to America. Briggs would become an outspoken critic of Garvey's Back to Africa scheme, but in the emotional year of 1919, the Crusader expressed agreement with agreement with the Central Nationalist program of the day, and this is a socialist agreeing to such a program. Now, one editorial surmised that, existing as we are in a hell on earth where mob murders, court injustice, widespread prejudice are the rule, it should be a comparatively easy matter to pull up stakes from out of this hellish soil of American mobocracy. The superiority of Negroid over Caucasoid, the classic subject of nationalist street corner orators, had its airing in the Crusader. In a spoof on the racist views of cinema producer D.W. Griffith entitled "The Negro and His Instinct," the alleged writer, A.J. Griffith, commented, "The Negro mind instinctively believes in himself and his race. What the Negro needs to know is that in many qualities he is superior to the white man. This may be accounted for by the fact that the Negro has not had the opportunity to be mean, brutal, cruel, and inhuman that the white have had for several centuries. Taken as a whole, the Negro people are better looking than the whites. Take the colored women, for instance. They are much more beautiful, judging them by every physical measure that can be applied. They are better formed, of better carriage, and fuller of life and female vanity." Briggs' alternative to American civilization presupposed the creation of not a black copy of Western ways, but the creation of an entirely new civilization based on socialism. This was a distinguishing feature from Briggs' brand of nationalism from that of Garvey's. Briggs would not condone American institutions, either white or black. Crusader articles on religion, such as "Savers of Souls and Sellers of Men," damned the Uncle Tom churchman. "The old Negro goes, let him go in peace," derided whole past generations of Toms. The established Negro press was criticized for missed opportunities to be militant. And finally, the uncompromising position led to opposition to Garvey and the UNIA. For a time, Briggs and the Brotherhood tried to infiltrate and influence the UNIA. Late in 1920, an important meeting of left radicals was called to discuss the possibilities of making the UNIA more class-conscious, and present were Brotherhood members Briggs, Otto Weiswood, Richard B. Moore, and W.A. Domingo. Hubert Harrison, the then literary editor of the Negro World, had called the meeting and brought with him the poet Claude McKay and the white communist Robert Minor. The details of what transpired are unknown, but Harrison soon resigned from Garvey's newspaper, and the members of the Brotherhood turned to a conscientious war on Garveyites. Using their contacts in the UNIA for the war, Briggs and associates were able to uncover some malpractices in Garvey's business dealings. Brotherhood spokesmen Moore and Thomas Potter accused Garvey of advertising ownership in a ship which he did not own. Garvey dared them to find out who owned the shady side. They did, and it wasn't Garvey or the UNIA, and moreover, there was a second ship without proper title. The Crusader published the findings and pointed out that Garvey had been selling tickets for a trip to Africa on one of the Phantom ships. It was when the ticket holders read these exposés and complained to authorities that proceedings were started which eventually led to Garvey's prosecution, imprisonment, and exile. Garvey retaliated against Briggs by advertising in the Negro World that Briggs was really a white man passing as a Negro. The irate Briggs brought suit, and in a tense courtroom scene, the two men were brought face to face. Briggs' mother was present in all her light brown splendor. Garvey opened by bringing a counter-libel suit. He told the judge of a Crusader article in which Briggs had said Garvey lost money in escrow because he didn't know enough about business to properly put money in escrow. And besides, Briggs had insinuated crookedness in an article which urged the Jamaican to forego a trip abroad and remain in New York during this critical period in the UNIA shipping enterprise. At this, the judge asked if it were not true that the Black Star Line was in financial trouble and didn't Garvey himself see a need to remain in New York. Garvey admitted he had had only one run to Cuba in the last 6 months. Then he produced, with appropriate fanfare, a letter written by Briggs and addressed to Garvey, which was, said Garvey, an open invitation to cooperate in overthrowing governments. The judge read the letter over, but he didn't see such meaning in it and found it otherwise irrelevant. Garvey lost his countersuit. Briggs eventually dropped his case when the UNIA printed a retraction. The retraction really didn't prove much, in Garvey's opinion. Briggs, being white in color, is a white man, even if the court said one drop of black blood makes him a colored American. Briggs' complexion problem was a recurring annoyance. He was once arrested by New York police for walking late at night with his Negro wife. On another occasion, Garveyites at a street corner rally brought up the old Briggs is white line. He happened to be in the audience and demanded a chance to reply. Mounting the platform, he forgot his hopeless stuttering problem and somehow found eloquence to hold forth for nearly a full 3 hours. The Briggs-Garveyite feud carried on into the 1930s. There was a time when Garveyites put a stop to a Briggs meeting by raiding the hall and turning out the lights. Sometime in the mid-20s, the Brotherhood of Briggs was merged with the Communist Party. The Brotherhood continued on to exist, at least through 1927, primarily as a recruiting agent for the party. Henceforth, Briggs would be cooperating with a part of white America, a communist part, but nonetheless American. This coalition came about, according to Brotherhood member Harry Haywood, because the black militants were too few to pull off revolution alone. The CPUSA offered acceptable revolutionary allies. When Briggs died in 1966, he was still a nominal member of the Communist Party. His years of service were also years of independent action and of the prodding of white party members to purge themselves of American ways of race prejudice. In other words, he attempted to maintain a focus of Negro first, much as he had done in working with the IWW previously. To the degree that the party was responsive to the Negro question, to that degree Briggs would work as national officials dictated. He heartily endorsed the emphasis on the Negro, shown at the World Congress in 1928. Writing for the party house organ, The Communist, he commended the Congress for its rigorous attack on white chauvinism, and he went on to add his opinion that prior to that Congress, prejudice, overt and covert, had made progress in Negro work well-nigh impossible. White chauvinism had manifested itself in open or concealed opposition to doing work among Negroes. The tendency was to ignore the leading Negro comrades when formulating policy. Furthermore, there was apparent punishment for Negro complaints. The Negro comrades were refused support in getting out the weekly news service, which was being sent to some 300 Negro papers, said Briggs. And Briggs could get away with this candid criticism, while many other party members might not. Briggs had valuable ties in the ghetto. In 1929, he was put in charge of the party's Harlem weekly, The Liberator. Under his editorship, The Liberator became a most important organ of Negro protest, covering both party-sponsored programs and activities of other ghetto groups. A major task for Briggs was to win over to communism the remnants of the Garveyites. His understanding of nationalism and his sympathy for many of its tenets made him particularly fit for this role. His tactic for converting nationalists was to criticize their leaders and their one-sided approach, while arguing at the same time that the party encompassed both a nationalistic perspective and a revolutionary attack on prejudice and discrimination, which would make integration and black and white unity a reality. This approach significantly differed from the party line. It should be noted that wherever the party was active, in either white Minneapolis or Negro Harlem, communist organizers often took leeway with their instructions from above. They had to be effective. Now, on the party line, while the National Party made statements lumping together as petty bourgeois nationalists the Garveyites, Negro businessmen, the NAACP, and the Urban League, and most other organizations, in Briggs' approach, the Garveyites were treated separately. He acknowledged that, quote, the main social base of the movement was the Negro agricultural workers and farming masses groaning under the terrific oppression of peonage and sharecropper slavery. And also included were sections of the Negro industrial workers, for the most part recent migrants from the plantations into the industrial centers of North and South. And what of the leaders of this Garvey movement, leaders which Briggs had fought with for so long? How were they to be described in the 1930s? They were described as the poorest stratum of Negro intellectuals, declassed elements, struggling businessmen and preachers, lawyers without a brief, etc., who stood more or less close to the Negro masses and felt deeply the effects of the crisis. For the Depression decade, quote Briggs, potentially the Garvey rank-and-file members are good fighters, willing and ready to wage a relentless struggle to free Africa, the West Indies, and the Black Belt of the Southern states. Briggs' paternalism with Garveyites was coupled with a merciless criticism of Negro businessmen and black liberals of the NAACP. He repeatedly exposed the emptiness of hopes in building race business. The self-help racket was seen as a blind alley. The scandal of an NAACP official who was a wife-beater got a sizable spread in the Liberator. On the other hand, the problems and emotions of the Harlem masses were written of gingerly. Bitterness of poor Negroes toward Jewish and Italian shop owners was criticized, and special stories were run to show how capitalists exploited other ethnic minorities as well as Negroes. However, Briggs was reluctant to be doctrinaire on the question of shop owner exploitation. An article in the November 18, 1933 Liberator deserves full quotation. It began, L. Levi, proprietor of a ladies' shop, sold to Miss Elizabeth Hyler a pair of shoes which turned out on close inspection at home to be of two different sizes. Miss Hyler immediately took them back to the store for an exchange. Levi was in no mood to dicker for an exchange. He refused and said it was her own fault that the shoes were odd sizes, and he wound up his little sermon by threatening Miss Hyler with a damn good punch in the jaw. He called her names and added that every nigger should be run out of Harlem, and that he would help to do it. Two colored workers who entered the store heard Levi cursing Miss Hyler and told him to refund the money to her. Levi, much frightened, refunded the money, adding he was going to see every black son of a bitch would be run out of Harlem. This story is printed in a communist newspaper, thoroughly anti-nationalist newspaper. Criticism of the party was handled in the Liberator with unusual objectivity. In editorials, Briggs chided white party members for racial prejudice. In news stories, he went so far as to allow a modest amount of criticism by non-party members. A story on a forum held at the Harlem YMCA told of a Miss Lael Lane who urged the party to cease labeling Dr. Du Bois as a middle-class apologist, which the party was certainly doing in the early 1930s. She said the party had distorted his position by calling him a segregationist. According to Miss Lane, Du Bois himself distinguished between segregation forced upon us by law and custom on the one hand, and segregation which we voluntarily elect in forming our own trade groups, social clubs, and cooperative societies on the other. She said that what Du Bois was arguing was the question of whether Negro radicals decided themselves on policy, or would it be forced upon Negroes by Communist Party dictate. She went on to argue that the Communists were forcing an unrealistic program in their Black Belt Republic. Given Briggs' interest in Negro independence of action, it is worth pondering the possibility that Miss Lane's story was purposely published as an expression of the editor's own viewpoint. The fade-out of Cyril Briggs as an important party figure began in 1935, significantly at the time of the turn to the United Front and the submerging of the Negro problem into the general category of white labor and labor in general. The Liberator, which had undergone a name change under Briggs to become the Harlem Liberator, now underwent a further change to become the Negro Liberator. Benjamin J. Davis, Jr., the rising star of the party, was named as editor-in-chief to replace Briggs, who would no longer be as active as before. Eventually, Briggs moved to Los Angeles, where he worked with the left-wing weekly The California Eagle and later with the nationalistic Herald-Dispatch. In Briggs's notes, there's a comment to the effect of a nervous breakdown causing him to leave New York in 1935. Whether this was from overwork or political problems is not known. According to Briggs's friend Harry Haywood, Briggs in his latter years was in recurring opposition to party policies and is alleged to have been critical of the party's drastically pro-Soviet line in the Russia-China doctrinal dispute. Finally, for Briggs, after years in the political background, he returned to the forefront just a year ago, 1966. He submitted a series of 4 articles on neocolonialism to the blatantly anti-white Liberator magazine out of Harlem, and an aptly titled organ for Briggs, but an unusual choice for a Communist Party member. The Liberator is thoroughly nationalistic. Now, viewed in the context of Briggs' long record of individual expression, the choice of magazines is understandable. As with all independent spirits, freedom has had its price. In the case of Briggs, he failed to receive the notoriety he deserved. Many of Briggs's subordinates from the old Brotherhood went on to important high-ranking positions in the party, included are Haywood and the international communist troubleshooter Otto Weiswood. Future students of the Third World and Black Power might want to know more about Briggs. He held many a contemporary view as far back as World War I.